Haven't pressed. Oh. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our next online event, which is we're running exclusively for you, our volunteers at the Royal Parks. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. As some of you may know, I am Bryony and I'm the volunteer and programmes manager at the parks. I'm hoping, like me, you're feeling a little bit more hopeful about being able to get back and volunteering in the parks soon, in line with the new roadmap that's been set up. So that's some really positive news. This evening, though, we have a really great talk focused on folklore and myths that surround some of the Royal Park's beloved trees. And we're going to be led through this fabulous talk by Greg Packman, who knows the parks and the trees really well, as he used to work for the parks in our tree team. Greg is now a senior tree inspector at Islington Council, but he works across the whole of London on various projects and is also the director of the Urban Tree Festival. And when I asked Greg for some notes on what I should say about him in his intro, he mentioned some things along the line of arboricultural legend and tree god, etc. So I'll let you all be the judge of that after you hear his talk. But before I let Greg get started, I'm just going to go over a few reminders of how the event is going to run and how you can interact and ask questions. So obviously for the duration of the event, your mic and camera will be off just because there's quite a lot of us. But if you do want to get involved and ask questions, you can do using the Q&A field, which should be at the top of your screens, and it's just a little speech bubble with a question mark in. If you are having any technical difficulties throughout, you can use the Q&A box, and if that isn't working, we also have Rachel, who is on the volunteering inbox, so please do email there. And you can also, there's a good function where you can like a question that someone else has asked, if that's something that you wanted to ask or no, and the more likes that question has, we'll probably ask Greg those questions first. So the talk is being recorded, so don't worry if you miss anything, and we'll make sure that we send this out afterwards. So I just wanted to quickly say a massive thank you to Rachel, who's actually organised all of these events, but she's sat behind the scenes doing all of the technical stuff. So thank you to Rachel for getting this sorted. So without further ado, let's get on to the actual interesting stuff, which is Greg. So thank you, Greg, for coming to talk to us.
Hi, thank you very much, Bryony, for that lovely, modest introduction. So my name's Greg Packman. I worked at the Royal Parks from 2015 to 19. It's an immensely special place and I miss it very much. And kind of one of the many things that I was able to get involved in with the Royal Parks was sort of just not just learning about trees, because obviously that was part of my job, but actually what's behind the trees and what the trees mean. And while today we may think of trees as part of ecology or landscape or construction, for millennia, not just centuries, but thousands of years, ever since the history of human civilization, trees have been central to that. And I've always been kind of fascinated to find out more, sort of learning the stories of the trees and what made them so special to people. So, kind of just a brief overview. So, almost every early human culture and civilization has sacred beliefs centering around trees. In Britain, we may think of the sort of the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon beliefs, or we may think of Norse mythology or Roman and Greek mythology, but every civilization, from Aboriginal Australian to the Native Americans to the native South Americans, all across the globe, a lot of their beliefs and their culture centered around trees. And a big part of that is that trees have been a real lifeblood for humans. They have been central to the development and civilization of humanity. And in many cases, our entire survival has been dependent upon trees. Humanity first came out of trees with tree-dwelling beings before moving around on two legs and being able to build and construct things and chop things down. And kind of because trees were so central to life, back then it was the only explanation was that they could be gifts from the gods, but also symbols of the gods as well. And many of you might be familiar with the image on screen, which is kind of the depiction of the tree of life, which is pretty much the branches reaching up into the heavens, as well as the roots being connected to the underworld. So trees were very much kind of the earth-dwelling portal, or not portal as such, but that connected beacon between the gods, the heavens, and the underworld. And the trees were there, extending and stretching into both. So I'm going to predominantly talk about 5 trees because there's so much to talk about. It's going to how do you fit it all into one presentation? So I'm kind of focusing on five trees. First of which, as you can see, is the silver birch, and it's predominantly going to be centred on kind of Celtic and ancient British beliefs, because there's just too much to do in one presentation and to do it justice. So I've sort of focused on these 5 trees. Now, the birch tree seemed quite appropriate to start with because it's seen as the bringer of light, promise, and new beginnings. Now, ecologically, the birch tree is known as a pioneer species. So when you have open ground or ground that's newly disturbed with nothing growing on it, the birch tree will be one of the first trees to colonise it. Therefore, it's referred to as a pioneer species. And because it's that pioneer species ecologically, it was seen as the tree of renewal and purification. And because it's one of the first trees to grow, and the first trees to come into leaf in the spring, the silver birch tree itself became symbolic as the tree of spring. And it's also very important in the Celtic alphabet, the Ogham. I think it was called the Baith, was its traditional name. It was the first letter of that alphabet. And the tree itself, one of its real sort of special cultural beliefs, was the Festival of Samhain. I think that's how you pronounce it. And that was the celebration of the end of harvest and the beginning of winter. It was one of sort of the opposite time of year to May Day. But Samhain was a very significant moment in the Celtic calendar because it was the celebration of a successful harvest, which was never guaranteed. And it was also a way of sort of celebrating and hoping for a good winter where there wouldn't be too much harsh weather and too much of a famine. Now, at the Festival of Samhain, they would use twigs and sticks from the birch tree, and the branches of the birch would be used to banish all the evil spirits and malignant spirits from the previous year, as well as to usher in sort of good spirits for the following winter to help bless the season effectively. And they also use something called besoms, which is an old term for a broom. And think of actually you can see in this image here, this is the besom or the birch broom. And that was a case of a birch branch with lots of small birch twigs wrapped around it. And that was one of the early first uses of a like a big brush. And of course, you may recognise that as kind of like being the archetypal witch's broom. And that's because back in those days, what were believed to be the brooms of witches were made from birch. And many of you may know the mushroom, the fly agaric, which is the sort of classic archetypal mushroom, the red-capped mushroom with the white spots. And that's a hallucinogenic mushroom. And that was a mushroom that was used basically so people could hallucinate. Sometimes it may have been for fun, but also it was a way for shamans to connect with the gods as well. And it was kind of in that hallucinogenic state around the Festival of Samhain with those birch besoms, the brushes, the brooms, it would be effectively where our sort of modern understanding of what witches supposedly look like flying around on broomsticks is kind of where that image came from. Kind of a group of people celebrating Samhain, hallucinating off sort of wild mushrooms that the fly agaric, sort of banishing evil spirits. Now, if you haven't heard of Samhain before, you've probably heard of its sort of modern incarnations as either sort of the beating the bounds festival that happened in parishes, or All Hallows Eve, or Halloween as it's known now. Now, beating the bounds was kind of, it still happens now. It's still kind of quite significant in more sort of rural sort of parish celebrations. That was quite literally with a birch stick going around the boundaries of their parish, sort of hitting things with birch sticks to banish the spirits. And of course, All Hallows Eve was again a more modern version of celebrating the banishment of evil spirits and welcoming in new positive spirits. Although, of course, we kind of have the corrupted modern version where it's all about dressing up as sort of zombies, skeletons, and witches and trick-or-treating. I'm not the biggest fan of Halloween for a number of reasons. I kind of quite dislike crass commercialisation, but I'm also not a big fan of how these sort of traditional sacred events have just been completely corrupted by commercialisation. But I won't rant about that because we're talking about positive things. But so the birch tree itself and that Festival of Samhain, I suppose that's a good example of how these sacred beliefs around trees, although the original meaning in many cases has almost been lost, that kind of hangover is still affecting modern cultural celebrations. And of course,
Greg,
yeah.
Just a second. I think there's some tapping going on, but we're all muted. Is it coming from your side? Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's fine. I'm pressing the back and forward button on the keyboard to change slides, so that might be it.
I don't know. I think it's quite constant. Is there anything rattling on your desk, perhaps?
I don't think so.
Okay, let's try again. Let's see.
Okay. Hopefully it won't. Okay, so here I've got a depiction of the goddess Freya, and Freya is very important in Norse mythology, as well as her counterpart Frigg in sort of Germanic mythology. And these were sort of the goddesses associated with fertility and purification and renewal as well. And because of those sort of shared beliefs, the birch tree was associated with the goddesses Freya and Frigg. And you see it's a symbol of fertility. But the birch tree is also associated with the celebration of Beltane, which is the modern May Day. And although we may commonly associate Hawthorn with May Day, and I'll be talking about that very soon, it was actually the birch tree was kind of where the first celebration of May Day was associated, because I mentioned that the birch tree was the symbol of spring. And in sort of later May Day celebrations, Beltane celebrations, they would cut a tree, cut all the branches and put it as a pole in the ground, and sort of do the kind of dancing fertility ritual around the trunk in the ground. But before that, it was quite often all the ribbons and such were tied to a living birch tree, and that kind of May Day celebration, the dancing around the maypole, the fertility ritual, was in essence a ritual and a tribute to the goddesses of fertility. And it's the May goddess, if I recall, was anointed in the village, in the parish, and they would also anoint a young man as a representation of the green man, and that would kind of be sort of chosen and selected at the Beltane festival, and then they would kind of have the blessings of the gods and the goddesses, and they'd sort of go off into the woods and procreate effectively. And apparently it was around the Festival of Beltane that was there was a lot of pregnancies afterwards, because that's effectively what the celebration was associated with. Now, moving on to the second tree, this is probably one of the most culturally significant trees, especially in Britain. Well, across all of Europe really, and that's the rowan tree. I'm not, my pronunciation on this isn't great, but I think it's called the Louis tree, and it's the oldest. I think the oldest known depiction of the rowan tree is in Greek mythology, and that was the goddess Hebe, who was the goddess of youth. Had an ill-fated attempt to try and pay tribute to the gods. And she had a goblet full of a sort of rejuvenating ambrosia, which she wanted to gift to the gods, but in her clumsiness managed to drop the cup and sort of spill the ambrosia. And then it was lost to the demons, who took it to the underworld. But in order to try and recover that cup, the gods sent an eagle to try and recover that cup. And in the ensuing fight between the eagle and the demons, the eagle was wounded and ended up shedding feathers and spilling blood. And when the blood droplets fell to the earth, a rowan tree grew in the place where those blood droplets fell. And I'll show you a photo on the next slide, but the leaves of the rowan are very feathered and feather-like, whereas the berries are representative of the blood drops. And if you kind of sitting there thinking the image of an eagle being sent to recover something is a bit familiar, that was effectively brought to life in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, when in the final film, Gandalf sends the eagle to rescue Frodo off of Mount Doom. So you can sort of see how the cultural beliefs and the representations of trees has made it all the way into sort of Hollywood blockbusters. But it wasn't just Greek mythology where the rowan is significant. In Norse mythology, the first woman was believed to have come from a rowan tree, whereas the first man came from an ash. And the name itself, rowan, is believed to come from Norse mythology, because part of the usage of the wood of rowan, where it was allowed to be used, was for carving runes in sort of Norse Danish culture. And in their communities, the seer was an incredibly important person, because they were the human connection to the gods. They were able to determine the god's will through the use of those runes. And of course, the runes were carved on blocks of rowan wood. And of course, the Norse word runa, R-U-N-A, is effectively a deviation of what became rowan, as well as the Swedish word rune, R-O-O-N, which is Swedish for red. Of course, the berries of rowan are red. So part of our common name now, rowan, it comes from that ancient Norse culture and belief. Also, in terms of in relation to the UK, in Celtic and ancient British mythology, it was a really, really important, incredibly important tree in the protection from witchcraft and enchantments. And this is from a time where the fear of witchcraft and evil spells effectively governed and dictated people's lives. So having appropriate protection against these evil spirits was perhaps one of the most important things that they could do. And if you look at you can see the image of the leaves and the berries, and you can see that very sort of almost feathered-like green leaf. And the berries themselves are protective because the colour red was seen to be the most effective protection against bad spirits and evil and bad magic. But hopefully you can sort of see just here, underneath the berry, you have sort of these little five-pointed marks. I've never been entirely sure why they naturally occur there on the berry, but that sort of five-pointed pentagram is also an ancient symbol of protection. So these berries were believed to be incredibly sacred in protecting against bad people, evil spirits, and bad magic and witchcraft. And the scientific name for rowan is Sorbus orchiperia, and the first part of that species name, orchiperia, comes from, I believe, the word orcus, which is a bird catcher. And ecologically, the rowan is really important in the winter and the autumn because of those berries. And many, many species of bird flock to a rowan tree to feast on the autumn berries, which again is that kind of link to the Greek eagle sent from the gods, as well as being really important in the spring. Now you can see the white flowers as well. They were referred, where you have trees of white flowers, they were seen as fairy trees, and they were trees that almost sort of topped up psychic ability. And so they were very, very prized as well as being great pollinators. But in terms of moving away from the cultural importance in sort of modern tree management, one of the reasons why rowan is still a really important species is because part of the way in which we're managing trees now is through deadwood, retention of deadwood and ecological invertebrate management. And when invertebrates live in the trees, they're detritivores, they're living off of decaying wood. But once they emerge into beetles, into hoverflies, or whatever their adult phase is, that food source that they had in the tree is no longer accessible to them. They then become pollinators. So part of the way we sort of manage veteran tree populations now is planting species such as rowan, hawthorn, apple, blackthorn, plum, quite close to a veteran tree or an area with really important invertebrate populations. So straight away when they emerge, they've got that new food source for them. So it's not just human life that these trees are protecting; it's also enhancing invertebrate life as well. Now, part of that protective quality of rowan meant that they're quite often planted near property, near people's homes, to offer protection from the evil spirits and witches. And that's a practice that's still quite common up in Scotland and in the Highlands, I'm told. And also people would take fragments of wood to carry about them on their person to protect them from the evil spirits. And in various ecological digs, archaeological digs, they've uncovered sort of crosses bound together made out of rowan twigs as like a sign and symbol of protection. But it was one of the real beliefs about rowan was that because it was so protective, if you were to cut down a rowan, as in actually cut down the entire tree without the proper permission, you would be cursed. It would bring you a lifetime of bad luck. But it was still okay to cut some parts of the branches. You had to almost ask the tree's permission to do so. You had to gain its blessing. I think, say a particular prayer or a chant for a ritual. And then branches of the rowan would be cut and sort of bound and tied together and placed over the entranceway to buildings and properties. And that was something else that offered protection. So cutting down the tree was something that was almost forbidden and brought complete bad luck to you. Now moving into the hawthorn, which is actually my favourite tree, and it's something that's absolutely steeped in folklore, in mythology and cultural beliefs. And this is perhaps the archetypal fairy tree. So there's kind of two main ways in which we likely find hawthorn. The first is that it's part of a hedgerow, hence its name, the bride of the hedgerow. But also they sort of grow either by themselves or in little groves on the landscape. But it was the hawthorn trees that were growing by themselves, isolated, that were said to be where the pixies and the fairies hid. And it was here that it was believed to be pathways to the other world, sort of various cultural beliefs of the underworld. And especially in Ireland, if you were a lonely, weary traveller, then the one thing that you should never do is rest or sleep underneath a hawthorn tree, because it was quite commonly believed that you'd be taken into the other world by the fairies, and it could take something like 7 years to find your way out. And again, because these trees were so sort of sacred and revered, if you were to cut down a hawthorn or a fairy tree, then that's another tree that would you would be cursed from destroying or vandalising. And one of the ways in which travellers were attracted to the fairy trees, a bit like the sirens in Greek mythology, is that the fairy god would appear to a traveller stood beside the fairy tree and would sort of beckon them in towards the tree, where they would be abducted and taken to the other world, sort of unable to escape for many, many years. But amongst the other names for the hawthorn, one of the more common ones is known as the May tree. And that's because the hawthorn is covered in profuse flowering across the month of May. And it's something that defines the entire landscape in May, seeing these amazing just flowers all across the landscape. And when I'm travelling back from London on the train, looking out the window in May, all you can see is just hills and hills and hedgerows full of these amazing white flowers. Now, part of the reason why it's called the May tree is because it was believed to flower in time for May Day and part of the May Day celebrations. But that, of course, predates the Gregorian calendar, in which, and because of that calendar, it shifted the dates. So I think we lost something like 11 days from the calendar before, and that basically distorted the date of when the hawthorn flower emerges. But before that, it was quite reliable that the hawthorn would blossom in time for Beltane. And then the blossoms would be cut and used for garlands, sort of either around necks or crowns as well. And this was a really sacred flower, and it was could only be used outside. Although there were a few, so I'm summing up my words here. Because of how sacred it was, there were still some beliefs as to why you couldn't bring it inside. And that's because the tree was said to be the smell of death, the blossom. And it was believed that if you brought the flowers of the tree inside, it would cause illness and could even cause death. And that's because the blossom had a very, very pungent fragrance and it smelt like death. And at that point in life, people were far, far more familiar with death than we are today in terms of being exposed to it. Back in the days before hospitals, before morgues, dead bodies would be stored in houses before they could be buried. So people were very, very familiar with the smell of death. But in modern science, it's been determined that there's a chemical that causes that smell in hawthorn blossom, and it's said to smell very, very similar to it's the same chemical found in decaying and rotting tissue. So the hawthorn blossom bizarrely has the same fragrance as decaying tissue, which is where that belief came from, which is almost quite at odds with some of the other beliefs of the hawthorn, because the leaves of the hawthorn, the fresh leaves, are edible. They're kind of referred to as cheese and pickle or bread and cheese. They've got a whole number of sort of regional names. And even today, they're still a key component of like a hedgerow salad, like the edible hawthorn leaves. And early in the morning, when the dew from the night before was still fresh on the leaves, young ladies were said to sort of cover their face in the dew water from hawthorn leaves to help beautify themselves. And then young men would sort of wash their hands in the water from the hawthorn leaves in a bid to try and improve their skill at whatever their craft was. But there's some quite interesting and bizarre, almost clashing and conflicting beliefs about the hawthorn. But it's one of the most sort of fascinating and stunning trees that we have. Also its amazing practical use in hedgerows, and of course not to mention the berries in the winter, which are also red, the red haws. So there's an element of protection about this tree as well. But one of its other quite important cultural aspects to Britain is the Glastonbury thorn, of course, which is a type of hawthorn. Now, it's believed that after the crucifixion of Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a relative of Jesus, brought the Holy Grail to Britain. Why he chose Britain at that time, I'm not entirely sure, but it was at Weirwood Hill that he thrust his staff into the ground, and the staff was made from a hawthorn branch, and there it started to grow. And this staff, which became a tree, said it was blessed by God and had divine properties, and it was able to flower twice in 1 year, both at May Day as well as at Christmas. And it was that blessing from God that enabled it to flower at Christmas. And it was also said that the crown of thorns when Jesus was crucified was made from hawthorn as well. Now, sadly, the Glastonbury thorn has been cut down and vandalised several times. The original one was believed to have been cut down during the Civil War, but fortunately they'd taken cuttings and grown sort of different clones of that tree in various locations. So it's been replanted several times, but for some reason people seem attracted to coming back and cutting down the Glastonbury thorn again and again and again. Most recently back in 2013, I think. But fortunately, because it's such a culturally significant tree to Britain, there's several clones of that tree growing around the country, also at Kew Gardens, where it's been propagated on several times. One of my other favourite trees, and one of the most important trees to Britain, is the yew tree. There's about 20 different trees in the UK which people claim are the oldest tree in Britain, and about 3/4 of them are yew trees. The other quarter, I think, are oak. The yew tree is an incredibly different and strange tree when you compare it to all the other native trees. It's the oldest trees in Britain are kind of, they say, over 2,000, between 2,000 and 3,000 years. I've even seen some reports saying that the Fortingall yew up in Scotland could even be up to 9,000 years old. And if that's true, that means that the yew tree, that tree, is almost as old as humanity itself, which is really quite remarkable to believe. But this example here, I'm not entirely too sure where the church is, but it's this amazing two trees just guarding the entranceway to the church. And one of the more common areas that you'll find these ancient trees are in churchyards. And that's because before the Roman colonisation of Britain and the introduction of Christianity, yew trees were one of the most sacred trees to the Celts and the pagans. And these yew trees were quite often grown or planted or found in sacred worship sites. And it was in these sites that druids would meet, and there would be sort of prayer circles, they'd be gathering spots. And when the Romans came and started conquering Britain, and then they brought Christianity with them, quite often the Roman priests would go to these sacred sites and sort of try to convert the masses there. So where we have some of the oldest yew trees in the country at these churchyards, they're basically ancient sites of worship, and these trees predate the churches. In fact, many of the ancient yews in Britain predate the religion of Christianity itself, which is really quite remarkable. With this, I thought, rather than putting any text, I just sort of let the images do the talking, because they're just absolutely stunning. So these are from Kingley Vale in West Sussex, and if anyone's been to Kingley Vale, they'll know just how incredible a location it is. It's just got one of the best collections of ancient yew trees, and they could be anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 years old. And you go to Kingley Vale, you walk around these ancient yew trees, and there's just a feeling in the air, something special. And you can't, well, for me, I couldn't quite describe it. There's just a feeling and a presence of being there that I haven't really felt anywhere else. And I spend a lot of time going to different tree locations, and Kingley Vale is just a whole, it's very strange to describe. But what I quite liked about Kingley Vale is that a lot of the old practices are still alive. When I went, there were people sat in prayer circles, sort of praying and meditating underneath these trees, which I thought was quite nice to see. But one of the, again, here's another, perhaps one of the biggest in Kingley Vale. But because of how long-lived and ancient these trees are, they were associated with longevity and immortality. And what many people will know about the yew tree is just how poisonous almost every part of the yew tree is. The bark, the seeds, and the needles, if you ingest them, then you'll at best be very ill, and at worst you'll have quite a painful death. And the poisonous of the yew tree was famed and very well known. But it's even mentioned in Macbeth, sort of brewing a tea from yew needles to poison someone. And I believe that the Roman emperor was allegedly poisoned from a tea brewed from yew needles as well, because of the toxins that were leached out in the brewing process. But despite the poisonous nature of the yew tree, it was also seen as a tree or a symbol of regeneration. Because if you on to the next image. If you sort of see the trees that are going down towards the ground, they will touch the ground and then they'll root themselves, and then they'll regrow into new trees. And if you were to cut a yew tree, it will regrow from the cut point very, very easily. As well as if you cut down a yew, it will sprout up from a stump as well. And it was because of that, how hardy and resilient these trees were, is where it was seen its sort of regeneration properties were quite revered. But also, despite how poisonous the tree is, it was also a symbol of protection against evil. Perhaps because it was so poisonous, it could poison and scare off the evil spirits as well. But in terms of more sort of practical cultural beliefs, something else that the yew tree is famed for is longbows. And one of the good, amazing properties of the yew tree is that where the heartwood meets the sapwood, you have two different strengths of wood. You have the heartwood, which is very, very resilient to compressive forces, so it can bend quite easily. Then you have the sapwood, which is very strong and can withstand tensile forces, so it can be pulled. And that, in essence, made the perfect material for longbows, and one of the reasons why the British Army at the time, well, the English militias and armies and archers were so successful is because they had these amazing longbows made from yew timber. Although, from what I understand, the yew trees at the time, because of the type of wood that had to be used, that cross between the heartwood and the sapwood, a good sized yew tree could only really yield 5 longbows from one tree. So from what I understand, a lot of the actual timber from yew trees were imported from France. And if anybody ever gets the chance to, then I would honestly really recommend going to Kingley Vale and having a look at these trees, or just any old church, because they have these absolutely incredible trees. Now, probably the tree that most people have been waiting for, this is the oak tree. And the oak is the king of, it's often seen as the king of trees, and it's kind of the most dominant in many cultures and beliefs. Kind of, think of the Green Man, which is perhaps the most iconic image in sort of British cultural beliefs pre-Christianity. That's a face adorned with a crown of oak leaves. And the tree itself is quite often associated with one of the chief gods, like the main gods, such as Zeus, Jupiter, or Thor. That's because the oak tree, is kind of seen and associated with strength and resilience and longevity, and even today it's still associated with sort of steadfastness and general strength. And also, for those who kind of know their sort of ancient gods, Zeus, Jupiter, and Thor are all effectively the gods of lightning and thunder. And as I come on to another slide, it's the thunder and lightning that's very much part of the association with oak trees as well. But it's the oak tree that's one of the most key and crucial to the British national identity and mythology. Many organisations, such as the Royal Parks, have an oak tree on their logo. The National Trust as well. And I think it's kind of almost seen as the oak tree kind of representing the sort of like the idealistic British values, as well as being such a crucial part of British history. And some people may disagree, but perhaps the oak tree has been more central to the history of Britain than almost any other tree. I think trees like the hornbeam would probably disagree, given how important that was culturally for British in terms of product, in terms of firewood and charcoal. But in terms of everything that the oak tree has given us, then it is arguably perhaps just the most important tree in British history. In fact, up until the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, you could argue that such was the importance of the oak tree in terms of its timber. It's perhaps the most important single thing in the history of Britain alone. One of the key associations and beliefs with the oak tree are the Druids. And they associated the oak tree with oak groves, and these were sacred worship sites. And the Druids themselves were believed to be the worshippers of the oak tree. And the term Druid is believed to be quite a literal translation of the word of an oak worshipper. Because as you can see from this image, the word for oak was door. And that in turn led to the name Dor being Druid. So as you can see, it's quite a literal translation from oak to Druid, although like very old language. And it was in these groves of oak, but also ash and hawthorn, which were the birthplace of fairies. So where you had a grove and a circular clearing, it was believed that these were incredibly sacred sites. And these were also sort of landmark focal and meeting points. It's where people in sort of regional areas would come to give, it would be a meeting point, it would be where religious sermons were administered. And that's kind of where today many will sort of know the terms gospel oak and honour oak. And that in part is because of that, these sort of meeting and preaching places. Now this tree here is the major oak, I'm sure many will realise. And it's easily the most famous tree in Britain, but it's also possibly one of the most famous trees in the world. So myself being in part of the tree industry, when I come across people from different countries all around the world, when you talk about British trees and British tree management, so many of them have heard about the major oak. And of course, the major oak in Sherwood Forest was believed to be the tree that Robin Hood lived in. Although I don't mean to spoil the illusion, but we don't actually think that that's true, because the major oak, it's believed to be about 800 years old now, but the date at which when Robin Hood was supposed to have lived would have meant that the major oak would have been alive at that point, but it would have been too young and too small for Robin Hood and his merry men to actually hide in. Well, there may well have been a nearby oak of a much larger size which would have done the job. But it's, yeah, perhaps the most famous tree, and it's kind of up there with the baobab trees and the mangrove trees and the California redwoods, when most people think of these stunning old trees. And the oak tree itself, it's a huge part of the British identity, with a lot of pubs, towns, even tube and train stations named after the oak tree, such as the Royal Oak, one of the most common pub names going, because of that association of Charles II hiding in an oak tree during the Civil War to escape execution. But as a tree, not just the tree, but the timber and the produce, the history of the British Isles has essentially been built on the back of the oak tree, because its timber was used for construction, for constructing houses, for constructing churches, the Parliament. It's an incredibly tough and durable and resilient wood. The rafters of Ely Cathedral are all oak timber. Many of them are original to the construction of the cathedral, which is sort of 700-800 years old, I think. And the tree would have had to have been about 200 years old at the point of it being felled and the cathedral being constructed. So that timber has lasted for somewhere between 800 to 1,000 years. And it's just that, how brilliant the timber was. It's what the early British towns were made from. And again, here you can see timber, the firewood, our Parliament, one of the most important buildings in the country. Although not everyone may sort of like what goes on there and who works there, but the building of Parliament, all the cathedrals, all made from timber frames, as well as the churches. And then the Royal Navy itself, one of the reasons why Britain had such a successful navy was because of the availability of the oak timber to build these amazing, successful warships. And then, of course, the bark of the oak tree being used to tan leather. And not to mention brewing, another sort of huge part of British cultural history, is that the early sort of brewing barrels sort of for beer and for whiskey were made from oak timber, and these were back in the days where safe water wasn't exactly easy to come by. So the fermenting process of brewing beer and then the tannins that leach from the brewing barrels into the beer was a huge part of British life, much as it is now, as it was back then, although different processes of creating that beer. Now these two images here are from gulls. Now you might have seen these on oak trees, or you might not have seen them before. And there's a whole number of species of gull and types of gull, and I'll sort of explain what they are. So a gull is created by a gull wasp. These are kind of tiny micro wasps which fly around in spring, and they look for the flowers of the tree species that they need. And in this case, it's an oak gull. So it'll be flying around in sort of April, May, when the oak flowers are out on display. And then with its sort of where the wasp has a stinger, it will inject like a liquid hormone into the flower, and that essentially corrupts the DNA of the flower. And rather than germinating and becoming an acorn, it creates these sort of small woody fibrous structures. And what happens is that there's an egg of the wasp that's inputted into the flower, and it turns the acorn into like an incubator, into like a little house for its offspring to grow in. And you can see where you've got those sort of small black holes. That's the exit hole from those gull wasps. Now that's sort of all good and well ecologically. It's a crucial part of the ecosystem of the oak tree. But culturally, the reason why these are so important, and this is kind of one of those bizarre discoveries that you kind of wonder, how on earth did they actually find this? But the medieval monks found these, and then they'd sort of collect them and grind them in like a pestle and mortar, and then they'd mix it with water, sulfuric acid, I believe, as well as honey. And what that did is it created like a black paste which was watered down, and that created an ink. Now the reason why that was important is because prior to that, there wasn't a permanent source of ink in Western culture. There was scribing onto wooden tablets or runes or wall paintings, and a lot of, sort of verbal messages. But there wasn't any real kind of recorded, documented history at that time that was permanent. And what this was in essence one of the first discoveries of Western civilization of a permanent ink. And this was at the same time they were discovering how to create parchments. So all of a sudden you had written, recorded language and history. And some of the most important documents in British history in the world, such as Magna Carta, parts of the Bible, even the American Constitution, I think, were written and signed with the ink made from these gulls. And that is, for me, it's perhaps the most important discovery in human history, because it's what took sort of local sort of word of mouth news and messages with no permanence, and it created that permanent record. And it also enabled, rather than sort of Chinese whispers, it enabled accurate messages to be spread around. And as small and as insignificant as these might seem to be, they are just perhaps the most important discovery and one of the most important things in human civilization that got us to where we are now, from sort of the Dark Ages into modern civilization. It's kind of all off the back of these tiny little marble gulls, and to me that just absolutely blows my mind. I think it's just absolutely incredible, and I kind of love to be able to travel back to sort of see the person who first discovered how to create ink out of these. It must have been a lot of trial and error, but yeah, if I wore hats, then I'd definitely be taking my hat off to sort of congratulate them for it. But anybody who might follow me on Twitter will know that I have a bit of an obsession with finding and looking for faces in trees. And there's a couple of reasons why I do that. And the first and most superficial is that it's quite fun. It's quite a nice, novel way to look at trees. But where we have faces in trees, this is from Aspel Nature Reserve in Suffolk, I think. It's because part of the spiritual belief of trees was that once humans died, their spirits lived on, and quite often their spirits would be absorbed into trees. I mentioned at the start about how the physical embodiment of the tree was that link between our world and the heavens and the underworld. And quite often people would go to trees and they would pray at trees because that was, it's like an ancient version of going to visit a gravestone or having a monument or a memorial for a loved one. And where you had like a depiction of a face in a tree, these were kind of more sacred trees where there was more of a spiritual connection. So people would actually seek out trees with human faces in. And in this case, it's like two old branches sort of occluded over there, but it leaves that physical like representation of the face. So these were very, very sacred trees that people would go to worship at. And if anybody's watched Game of Thrones, you perhaps remember the Weirwood Tree, which were the special trees which were the sites of worship where people would go to pray. And of course, this is one I found in Epping Forest. I sort of refer to it as the Gargoyle Tree. And of course, gargoyles were developed, carved out of stone to help banish evil spirits. And again, I mentioned about the belief about how certain tree species banished evil spirits as well. So I think this tree with this sort of feature would be another guardian against the evil spirits. And this is a tree of heaven in the city of London, with what I sort of refer to as the Picasso face. I'm not quite sure what spiritual protection this might offer, but it's quite a bizarre one to look at. And then this is the Screaming Tree. Again, these would have been sort of natural features of the tree, but create these humanoid features. These would have been places of pilgrimage, of worship and sacrifice and offering as well. And this is a walnut in the Inner Temple Gardens. I can only guess that this would perhaps be a symbol of the god's displeasure with the frowning face tree. And not all tree mythology is sort of nice and positive. There's a huge part of the history of trees in the British woodland where trees and the woodland have been kind of symbols of fear and terror as well. As much as we may kind of revere and worship trees, especially in the ancient days, there was a real fear about the woods, about the depths of the forest, so like the evil spirits that live there. And you think about, I think, is it Fangorn Forest in Lord of the Rings? So anyway, and the Hobbit, it's the forest where the evil spirits lay. And then in Harry Potter as well, they have the Forbidden Wood where they're not allowed to go to, because as much as we may worship and revere trees, it was also a place where people were banished, where bandits would live, where evil spirits would wander. And perhaps a tree like this, which is from Epping Forest, with the screaming monstrous face, it could also be a symbol of the evil spirits as well. And again, another screaming, terrified face. And where you have here, you can see cavities in the trunk. Sometimes when I was working in Kensington Gardens, I'd be inspecting a tree and I'd find a cavity in a tree, but I'd sort of see small bundles of flowers placed inside the cavity. And that's a practice and a belief that dates back thousands of years, because I mentioned about how the trees were seen as the physical embodiment of where the human spirits went to rest. So leaving tributes in these trees was also a very common practice to try and appease the gods to help their spirits, help their ancestors' spirits move over to the afterlife, into the heavens. Tributes would be given to the tree, often put in these holes in the tree, in these cavities, to help the spirits move on to the afterlife. Again, kind of appeasing these monstrous, evil, horrible faces in the trees was a way of trying to pacify the gods. And this is the final slide. But this is the tree that we started with in the opening slide. So this is one of the most amazing trees in Epping Forest. It's on Chingford Plain, just outside Chingford in East London. But down here at the base, you can see you've got this cavity, this hole in the root plate. And in the ancient days, that sort of cavity, it would be seen as that would be an entranceway to the underworld. So these would be forbidden places where people would only go out of sheer terror and desperation to try and offer and appease the gods. So that's all for tonight. Thank you for coming. I'll pass back to Bryony. I hope it's been interesting for everyone. It's been quite an interesting and challenging presentation to put together, sort of knowing what to include and sort of how much to put in, because there's just so much to include. It's kind of knowing what to include. But yeah, thank you. I'll pass back to Bryony.
Thank you so much, Greg. Really, really interesting. I've got a couple of questions. So one of them says, what do the dates on the illustrations mean, e.g. oak June 10th to July 7th?
Right, yeah. That's the Celtic calendar. So the Celtic calendar has 13 months, and each sort of month, not like a Gregorian calendar month with sort of 31 days, they'd each be shorter, and each tree was sort of representative of a month in that calendar, with the oak being sort of June to early July, holly being July to August, and then birch and the yew being sort of more winter trees on that calendar. So those are the dates that are representing that month in the Celtic tree calendar.
Cool, thank you very much. Another question, or it's kind of more of a statement, but I wonder what you think of it, is blossoming of hawthorn / the May tree, and this may change with global warming. Do you think that's true, that its blossoming time would change with global warming?
I think that's absolutely true. So the Woodland Trust have something I think they call Nature's Calendar, where they ask people to record the flowering of trees and plants and the emergence of insects and the appearance of birds every year. And I think they are noticing quite a big pattern in when things are changing. And because all my work is in London, but I live in the countryside in Bedfordshire at the moment, when I'm in London, I see the trees in leaf and in flower much earlier than I do in the countryside, because I think in London it's sort of like 4 degrees warmer than where I am now. So that so that impact of rising temperatures and global warming, it will have a knock-on effect on nature, and I think in many cases it will be quite a bad impact as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got another couple of questions. One is, what acid did the monks use for the ink? Do you know?
So the one that I read was sulfuric acid. Yeah, that's what I've read. I think I've seen it a couple of times in different sources. But again, it's one of those things of how on earth they discovered that, I don't know. But I think it's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of my favourite facts that I've ever learned from you about the galls as used for ink. So Vicky says, thanks for the presentation. Just wondering if you can give any information about the different kind of bark patterns seen on trees. I found it fascinating on my daily walk, seeing the different patterns of bark.
Yeah, and
Good question.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that reminds me of something that I actually forgot to mention. So here we have the bark pattern of an oak. This is an English oak, Quercus robur, and that has a very sort of deeply furrowed bark. And that kind of, one of the reasons why the oak, so I'll just, to answer that, I'll go back to the point that I forgot to include. One of the reasons why this tree was associated with the lightning gods is because these furrows along the trunk act like little water canals, as well as attracting lightning. So the oak tree is very frequently struck by lightning, because lightning was associated with gods like Thor and Zeus and Jupiter. To find a fragment of lightning struck oak was believed to be a real good luck omen. So people would carry fragments of lightning struck oak with them as like a blessing and a good luck omen. In terms of the other bark patterns, so the hawthorn has a much smoother bark than the oak, and it's kind of like a green.
You've gone a bit quiet, Greg.
Okay, sorry. So the hawthorn has a grey green colour. It becomes much more cracked, similar to an oak. The birch, of course, has the white silvery bark, which can be peeled off in its early years, but as it grows older, it becomes more black and crackened and almost like lumps of coal at the base of the tree. The rowan has a very, very different bark. That's much, much smoother, and it's almost like a browny purple colour. Was there anything else on the question about the bark?
No, but I think maybe later in the year we might be able to book you in again for a more tree ID talk, possibly, if you'd be up for that. I think that would be great for all of our volunteers. I think that is all the questions. Rach, you had a good question about
yeah, although we're actually quite a bit we're coming up to past the end of the talk now, so I think we're probably don't need my question as well, but thank you very much for everyone who sent in questions, and we've had loads of really positive feedback as well, lots of people messaging saying thank you for a brilliant talk, so thank you very much, Greg.
Yeah, so thank you very, very much, everybody. As I said before, Rachel will send out the recorded version of this if you missed any of it or you want to listen back to some of the facts, and also a feedback form so we know what to improve for last time. It may possibly be moving platforms to Zoom because I know a few people have had a few problems. But thank you so much again to Greg for his wonderful and, as always, informative tree talks. And thank you very much to Rachel for all of your tech support and organising it. And thank you very much for everybody for coming. And hope to see you in the park soon or on here again. So thanks very much, everybody, and have a good evening.